Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Americans' Changing Views of Renewable Energy Policies. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, as part of our RPS collaborative. Our host for this webinar is CESA Executive Director Warren Leon. Warren also directs the RPS collaborative. And we have with us today Sarah Mills from the University of Michigan. Before I pass it over to Warren and Sarah for our presentations, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console, you can use the little orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We do expect to get a lot of questions today, so to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides within about 24 to 48 hours. And we'll also be posting these webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Warren Leon. As I mentioned, Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me first tell people something about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or as we affectionately call it, CESA. Excuse me. CESA is a national organization composed primarily of state agencies that promote and support clean energy development. We have members in 19 states, and you could see our members up here on the screen. We're always looking for additional members to enter into our organization. If we could go to the next slide. In addition to our work with our members, one of the other things we do is we run the RPS Collaborative, which is funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. It's a way for state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and other stakeholders to exchange information about what's going on in the wonderful world of RPS. And we do webinars like this one. We have a monthly newsletter which reports on news about RPSs around the country, and we produce periodic reports. If we go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be focusing on a really interesting topic. The University of Michigan has been involved for more than a decade in the national surveys on energy and environment, and they've collected a lot of data. They've seen trends, and they could tell us a lot about what Americans think about renewable energy in general, and more specifically about renewable energy policies and RPSs. And to talk to us about this, we have with us today Sarah Mills, who is a senior project manager at the University of Michigan Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. She serves as project manager for the National Surveys on Energy and Environment and for the Center's Energy and Environmental Policy Initiative. Her research, separate from the surveys, considers how renewable energy development impacts rural communities, excuse me, the disparate reactions of rural landowners to such projects, and how state and local policies facilitate or hinder renewable energy development. She has a PhD in land use management. Let me turn this over to Sarah because she has a lot of interesting things to share with us.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Warren, and for having me here today. And thanks for everybody who tuned in or who will watch this in the future. All right. So let me dive right in. There we go. Now I've got it. What I thought I would do is first provide you with more of an overview of the NSEE, or the National Surveys on Energy and Environment, the survey program that all of the data that I'll show you today is drawn from. Then what I'll do is talk about the findings from a report that came out in late October, which pulls together all of the data that we've carried on the survey in the last 10 years that has anything to do with renewable energy policy, or renewable energy technologies more generally. And then I thought I would also include a couple slides at the end that walk you through the findings that we released just last Thursday from our latest fall 2018 survey. And I'll wrap up with just talking about some of the other renewable energy policy work that we're doing here at University of Michigan. All right, so first, the National Survey on Energy and Environment, NSEE, as its name suggests, we are a national survey of public opinion related to energy and environmental policy, but more specifically, we talk about energy policy and attitudes about climate change. The survey draws a random sample of telephone numbers, both cell phone and landline, for adults in the U.S. And each survey wave, we interview between 700 and 1,000 Americans. The survey began in the fall of 2018 as a collaboration between two political scientists. One, Christopher Borick at Muhlenberg College, he's a nationally recognized public opinion researcher, and he runs the Muhlenberg Institute of Public Opinion, which actually conducts the survey. The other researcher that founded the survey is Barry Rabe, who's a professor here at the University of Michigan, and he specializes in environmental politics and policy. Since that time, since 2018, we've run the survey twice a year, every spring and fall, so we've just completed our 20th survey. And as I mentioned earlier, every survey wave, we cover attitudes about climate change, but then we have a rotating series of questions that cover different aspects of energy policy. So this is a partnership between University of Michigan and Muhlenberg College, and I should note that all of our funding for the surveys to date comes from the general funds of these two colleges. Also, I think what's unique about our survey is that we have a serious commitment to research transparency. The top-level results for each of the questions that we ask, and the survey instrument itself, where you can get the full question text, we post online very soon after the survey is complete. So the fall survey that we just finished a month ago, those top-level data and the survey instrument are already online. We've also gone through an extensive effort over the last couple of years to prepare the data sets that we can share with other researchers. And so the data from each of our past waves is online for anyone to download freely. And if you're interested, I can point you to where you can get that from our website. As I mentioned, what I'll talk about today is one of the reports that we did that we've branded as NSEE at 10. It's effectively our 10th anniversary celebration, pulling together anything that we've covered over the last decade on a range of specific topics. So I've listed those 7 reports that are part of this NSEE at 10 series here. You can see we put out a report on fossil fuels, so how Americans feel about coal, natural gas, pipelines. The next one was on federalism, the extent to which level of government should be regulating climate change and energy policy. I'm not going to read them all. You see we've covered carbon pricing, transportation policies, and then in bold here, the report that I'll talk about today on renewable energy. I also wanted to note, though, we have 2 more reports in this series that we're anticipating coming out soon. In the next week or 2, before the holidays, we'll be releasing a report that covers attitudes about adaptation versus mitigation, and included in there are questions that we've asked about geoengineering. And then early next year, we'll have the report out that covers all of the data we have about attitudes concerning climate change. All right, so again, what I'll present to you now is coming out of this report that we released in October on renewable energy. So as you can tell from this slide, support or opposition for a renewable portfolio standard is something that we've asked about frequently on the NSEE. We've covered it 10 times over the past decade. And the other thing that you can see looking at all of those blue bars is that we've consistently found very high support for renewable portfolio standards. Overall support was actually highest on our very first survey, where 84% said that they supported the policy, but strong support, so the darkest blue here, hit a high on the fall 2017 survey a decade later. The other thing that I'd note from this is that even at the peak of opposition down here in spring 2013 and spring 2015, just 22% of Americans said they were opposed to state-level renewable energy requirements. One of the things that I should note here is that our question text has varied out slightly over this time period, and we've actually never asked explicitly about a, quote, renewable portfolio standard. The question text for our most common question asks respondents whether they support or oppose this statement, and I'll quote it here. State governments should require a set portion of all electricity to come from renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power. So that's the question that we're reporting out here. Given this high support that you see overall, it's perhaps unsurprising that we find support for a renewable portfolio standard spans the political spectrum. So this is the same data that I showed you on the previous chart, but now it's showing net support. So we're taking the percentage of individuals who say they would support an RPS and subtracting from it those who say they would oppose one. And you can see that for each of the 10 survey waves, there's net support among Democrats, independents, and Republicans, and often by very wide margins. The narrowest margin is down here in spring 12 among Republicans. It's a margin of 20 points. And on this wave, it was 58% of Republicans who said they supported state renewable energy requirements, compared to 38% who opposed such requirements. You can see that Democrats have generally had much higher net support. It's been well over 60 percentage points for all of the survey waves where we've carried this question. At this low point here in spring 2013, it was just 14% of Democrats who said they opposed a renewable portfolio standard. So that's even at the low point for Democrats. It was just 14%. I mentioned earlier that on NSEE we ask about attitudes towards climate change, and across these surveys, no matter what energy policy we're looking at, we consistently find that support for climate policy is highest among those who believe that climate change is primarily caused by human activity, often followed closely by those who at least partially believe that there's an anthropogenic element to climate change. What's surprising here, we think, is that there's a wide margin of those who believe that the climate is changing, but caused by natural patterns, here in this gold color. Those folks still say that they would support an RPS, and again, by a pretty wide margin. Even more notably, in terms of energy policy, on 7 of the 10 waves where we've asked the question about RPS, we have net support among those who tell us that they do not think that climate is changing. So overall, these high numbers of Americans who support renewable portfolio standards are coming, obviously, from a wide cross-section of both the political spectrum and attitudes towards climate science itself. Here's one more net support graph showing the exact same data, but now it's broken down by whether or not the respondent was living in a state that had a renewable portfolio standard. the mandatory RPS, this is one of the 29 states that has the binding standards. You can see that for a couple of waves between here spring 2012 and fall 2013, there's statistically significant difference between these two groups, those who are in states that have a mandatory RPS and those that aren't. But generally, there's no real difference in attitude towards an RPS based on whether or not your state has one. And one of the reasons that we think this may be the case is that our survey finds that most Americans don't know if their state has an RPS or not. So we've asked this question twice, once in 2008 and again in 2015. And on both of those surveys, more than half of respondents volunteered that they weren't sure. So the options that they're given are, yes, my state has a renewable portfolio standard, or yes, my state requires use of renewable energy, no, it does not. These people volunteer that they don't know. And that's among the highest rates of unsure that we see on any question that we've ever asked on NSEE. This graph here only shows those who live in a state with a binding standard here on the right, or those who live in a state with no RPS, because it's kind of a tricky question to answer if you live in a state with a voluntary goal. So we've left those out here. What I find interesting is that among those who do provide an answer, they tend to think that their state doesn't have an RPS. And that's true whether you live in a state that, in fact, has no RPS, or you live in a state that does have an RPS here. So even if respondents were just guessing at random, you wouldn't statistically expect such a result, particularly over on this right-hand side. So the bottom line, we think here, is that this is a policy that most Americans don't follow, and more often they think that their state does not have requirements set for renewable energy than states that then think their state does have such a policy in place. All right, the next couple of slides look at what happens when you attach a price tag to the policy. That's these kind of price tests are things that we carry on a range of energy policies on the NSEE. As we find with lots of other policies, whether you're talking about a carbon tax or cap and trade, we find that once you attach a price tag, the support for the policy does drop. This is showing a series of questions that we asked in 2015. And here on the left, you can see when asked about support for a renewable portfolio standard, but where there's no cost stated, 72% of Americans say they would support such a policy. When we then ask those very same respondents whether they would support an RPS if the cost was $25 per year per family, and support drops 14 percentage points compared to this no-cost option. But you can see there's still majority support for an RPS. In this third question, those same respondents were again told that the renewable energy requirement would increase electricity costs by $50 per year. And here, support drops by an additional 13 percentage points. And so we wind up with 45% support for an RPS and opposition is at 49%. So here there is net opposition for a renewable portfolio standard with a price of $50 per year. This price sensitivity isn't limited to any one group. Here you can see that the data follow generally the same pattern, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Support among Democrats actually dropped by slightly more than Republicans when you compare this no-cost option to the $50 scenario. But because Democrats started with higher baseline support, you still see majority support among Democrats, even at the $50 per year cost. Let's see, it's adding up to 54% support among Democrats for an RPS at $50 per year. We don't see that same thing over here at Republicans, in part because their initial starting point of support was only at 60%. So with a $50 cost, it drops well below 50%. Another way to get at this same idea is to asked directly about the respondents' willingness to pay more for renewable energy. And that's a question that we've carried on almost every survey that we've run. So I apologize for having so much going on this slide. I'll try to walk you through a couple of the things that stood out to us. So the first thing to note is overall, over time, the proportion of Americans who've said they're willing to pay at least some additional money for more renewable energy to be produced ranged from 48% here to about 64%. So that's adding up all of these bars above the x-axis. However, many Americans are only willing to pay a small amount. You can see here in this like goldenrod color that it's roughly 20% of Americans who say that they're only willing to pay between $1 and $50 annually. What's harder to see, though, is that we find some evidence that there might be a growing portion of Americans that are willing to pay much more for renewable energy. So if you look at the decade-long average of those who are willing to pay at least $100 per year, that's these shades of blue up here, the decade-long average is 17%. On the spring 2018 survey, we have 25% who say they'd be willing to pay at least $100 per year. And we see similar results from the fall 17 survey. What this suggests is that there's potential growth in green pricing programs where consumers can opt in to pay a premium on their electricity bill for additional renewable energy. But there are a substantial portion of Americans who are willing to pay quite sizable amount for additional renewable energy. There are political differences, though, in willingness to pay a premium for more renewables. And that's especially evident on the most recent, the last two surveys. So on the most recent survey, 29% of Democrats and 30% of Republicans say they would pay at least $100 per year for more renewable energy production. And that's up from a decade-long average of about 20% for these two groups. So it's 30% compared to the decade-long average of about 20%. The percentage of Republicans who are willing to pay $100 more per year was 19% on the spring 18 survey. And that's also up from the decade-long average, but it's only up 5 percentage points. Overall, it's about 14% of Republicans over the course of the last decade who say they'd be willing to pay at least $100 per year. And now we're up to 19%. So that was about willingness to pay for a renewable portfolio standard. Another line of questioning that we've covered on the survey is trying to understand what Americans think are the other benefits of renewable energy development. So on this slide, I've shown the data about whether the respondent agreed or disagreed with the idea that renewable energy requirements will boost state economies. So there was strongest agreement with this statement on our very first survey in fall 2018. And we found that 77% of Americans agreed that renewable energy requirements would be an economic boon for states. That number fell over the course of the next three times that we asked the question to 56% here on the fall 2013 survey. But of course, that's still the majority who say that states will boost their economies by requiring greater use of renewable energy. The perceived economic advantage of state renewable energy requirements changes, though, when respondents are asked about their state acting before neighboring states do. So here, the question text is, my state's economy will be damaged if it requires greater use of renewable energy while neighboring states don't. On the 5 NSEE waves where we've asked this question, overall attitudes were pretty evenly split. On the fall 2008 wave and fall 2010 wave, Slightly more Americans said that their state's economy would not be harmed, so they disagreed with that statement by enacting renewable energy requirements ahead of neighboring states. On the fall 2009 survey and on the fall 2017 survey, more Americans agreed with the statement, so they did think that their state's economy would be harmed if it acted ahead of their neighbors. What I think is interesting, though, is how this plays out across the political spectrum. So what you can see is that from wave to wave, attitudes among Democrats and Republicans generally follow each other. So we see this same kind of shape to the curves, but Democrats across all of these waves have posted net disagreement that their state's economy would be damaged. So more Democrats disagreed with that statement than agreed with that statement on all of these waves. By comparison, there was net agreement among Republicans on 3 of the waves. And you can see on the most recent 2 times that we've asked this, it was right here, it was 12% more Republicans thought that their state would be at a competitive disadvantage by enacting a renewable portfolio standard ahead of neighbors than those who disagreed with that statement. Okay, so we know from the data that I presented earlier that there is majority support for renewable portfolio standards across the political spectrum. But Democrats tend to be more in favor of an RPS than Republicans. So a couple of times we've also tried to figure out what happens when you remove the policy and just talk about support for the technology. So when you don't talk about a renewable energy requirement, but just talk about support for increasing the use of renewable energy. What we find consistently is that the gaps between the parties get smaller. So here you can see Democrats are more in favor of increasing the use of wind energy and solar than Republicans. So this is Democrats increasing the use of wind energy. Here's Republicans increasing the use of wind energy. There is a gap there, but by a much tighter margin than when you compare the gap between their support for renewable energy requirements, these first two, the bars to the left. This suggests that lower Republican support for renewable energy requirements is less of a reaction to the technology than government intervention in the electricity market. The other thing that I find interesting, because I'm interested in siting of renewable energy projects, is that among Democrats, there's actually less support for increasing the use of wind energy than there is for a state mandate. So support drops slightly. We're asking this among the very same individuals, so we can kind of compare these. The margin of error isn't quite as important here. This suggests that there's at least a small portion of Democrats who generally support renewable energy and even state requirements for renewable energy, but who don't support particular renewable energy technologies. To try to understand what's going on and why we see this gap in support between wind energy and solar energy, we have asked a range of questions about the perceived positive and negative impacts of each of these energy sources. So here you can see there's no real difference in terms of job creation. Overall, most Americans say that both solar and wind energy create jobs. There's also no real difference in terms of whether solar panels or wind turbines pose visual or aesthetic problems. Only about a third of Americans agree that solar panels or wind turbines are ugly, and there's no statistical difference between these two bars. But where there is a difference is with respect to reliability. So for both of these technologies, most Americans disagree that solar panels or wind turbines are unreliable sources of energy. But there's a 9-point gap here between those who agree that solar panels are unreliable versus agree that wind turbines are unreliable. Actually, the gap is down here in the disagree, sorry. And this 9-point spread echoes the spread that we see in support for these two technologies. Often in our overall survey findings, we find that about 9% more say they support solar energy than support wind energy. Just to underscore how non-climate benefits of renewable energy fit into how people are thinking about renewable energy technology, here's additional data that we collected on wind energy from the fall 2016 survey. And here you can see that far more Americans believe wind turbines create jobs than help limit climate change. So it's 81% who say wind turbines create jobs, whereas it's just 58% who say wind turbines create or help limit climate change. I think this helps explain why we see such high support for renewable energy and renewable energy policies such as RPS, even among Americans who might not think that climate change is occurring. They see other benefits in renewable energy technology. So just to summarize what we found in this report covering 10 years of survey data about renewable energy, first, there's wide support for renewable energy and only slightly less support for RPS mandates. We consistently find upwards of 70% of Americans support renewable portfolio standards, and upwards of 80% say they support increasing the use of wind or solar in their states. But a renewable portfolio standard in particular is not a policy area that Americans follow most closely or follow very closely. Most don't know whether or not their state has an RPS. We find that a majority of Americans are willing to pay something more to have additional renewable energy produced, and also that a growing portion of Americans is willing to pay substantially more, upwards of $100 annually, for additional renewable energy, again suggesting that there may be a growing pool of interest in voluntary green pricing programs. We find wide support for renewable energy, even among climate skeptics, likely due to the idea that renewable energy provides additional non-climate benefits, particularly in the form of economic opportunities such as job creation. But we've also found that state mandates are not necessarily seen as providing a competitive advantage to a particular state. All right, that was a rapid summary of the 27-page report that came out in October, covering, again, the data that we collected from fall of 2008 to the spring of 2018. Now what I'll present is the data that we have from the fall 2018 survey that we, again, just released last week. So on this latest survey, we again asked about overall support for increasing the use of solar and wind in the respondent's own state. And we find that, as before, a large majority of both Democrats and Republicans say they support increasing the use of renewable energy. There's slightly higher support for these renewable energy technologies among Democrats than there are among Republicans. But even so, among Republicans, we have 79% support for increasing the use of solar energy and 72% support for increasing the use of wind energy. By comparison, among Democrats, it's 92% who say they support adding more solar and 88% who say they support adding more wind energy in their states. Once you start to talk about the policies, though, that may be used to drive additional renewable development, you can start to see the gap between Democrats and Republicans widen. Again, something to note is that there's still majority support among Republicans for requiring the use of renewable energy, so for renewable portfolio standards. It's 64% in this latest survey. And a majority of Republicans also support increasing subsidies for renewable energy. That's at 65% of Republicans who say that. But with upwards of 90% of Democrats supporting both of those policies, this is where we start to see the gap widen between Democrats and Republicans. this time around on this latest survey, we also added some new questions that we hadn't carried before to try to understand what it was about renewable energy that was appealing to so many Democrats and Republicans, again, regardless of whether or not they believe that climate change is already occurring. Among Democrats, you can see that a wide range of benefits appeals to them. They're most likely to say that renewable energy contributes to economic development, and the question was worded that it's contributing to economic development for communities such as increased jobs or local tax revenue. And Democrats were also very likely to say that renewable energy helps lower levels of air pollution, improving human health. But even the least resonant benefit among Democrats, that is the one right here, that renewable energy helps us be good stewards of God's creation, that was something that 78% of Democrats agreed with. Among Republicans, the idea that renewable energy helps the United States be less reliant on foreign energy sources, what we've termed here as energy independence, was the most resonant benefit. So 80% of Republicans agree that renewable energy sources help us be less reliant on foreign energy sources. But they were also 78% here agreed that renewable energy helps improve human health. The least resonant benefit among Republicans was down here, the idea that renewable energy helps limit climate change. Just 53% of Republicans agree with that statement. So that was a whirlwind tour of the data that we have available and collected. Before turning it back over to questions about the survey itself, I thought I would just fill you in on a couple other things that we're working on here at U of M that might be of interest. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of additional reports from the NSEE survey data, we have reports underway looking more at carbon pricing, and we have actually just came out with this report on carbon pricing, testing a couple different revenue use options. And the report on geoengineering and adaptation should be coming out in the next 2 weeks. We're also working on a number of non-survey research projects. We have a new initiative called the Renewable Energy Policy Initiative that is trying to understand how a range of state and local policies either facilitate or hinder renewable energy development in those states. As part of that, we have research projects underway right now looking at property taxation on renewable energy facilities and what that means for the local communities that are hosting either wind or solar facilities. We're looking at state versus local siting authority and how that may change whether or not you're actually able to site projects in particular places. I'm working on how renewable energy is considered in state farmland preservation programs. So whether you're allowed to site utility scale wind or solar farms on land that's enrolled in state farmland preservation programs. I also have a couple colleagues working on how equity is considered within state RPS and solar policies, trying to understand what states are doing to get renewable energy into low-income communities. And I'll also just mention that, as given in the introduction, I have a range of ongoing research projects looking at how renewables impact host communities, particularly rural communities where wind and solar farms are being placed. And this looks at community reactions to projects and also how local governments are planning for energy infrastructure. So that's it for slides. Thank you again so much for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions that may have come in, Warren.
Hey, thanks very much, Sarah. That was a great overview of your surveys and recent reports. So we did receive quite a few questions, but I need to tell the audience we probably have room for a few more questions. So you think of others, please still send them in. There were 4 or 5 people who wrote in with the same sort of question, asking you to say a little bit more about your sample of 700 to 1,000 adults. Is it carefully distributed geographically? Are there factors considered in terms of the socioeconomic characteristics of the population, the age of the sample? And do you have any breakdowns for any of those other factors other than Republicans, Democrats, and independents?
That is a really good question. So, in terms of how the sample is chosen, we effectively buy a whole bunch of phone numbers from a company that sells random phone numbers. It is evenly distributed across the U.S. It's really important in terms of reaching a diverse audience that you nowadays, especially, that you include cell phones as well as landline phones. So that helps us reach particularly younger populations. Also, all of the data that we have, we then weight according to census characteristics. So we weight by gender, race, age, income, and educational attainment. Our weights aren't huge, so what that means is that we do a pretty good job of getting a range of individuals to answer the phone for us. We do collect a series of demographic information, including those that I just asked, to allow us to actually weight that data. And we have broken down, or we can break down the data based on any of those characteristics. We rarely find differences that are associated with, for example, age or income. And so we look at it, but we don't usually report it out. This is a situation where, because all of that data is available online, if there's researchers or people that have a specific question in mind about how RPS plays out across income brackets, that's something that we can absolutely do. It's just we haven't seen anything that's really, there's no clear pattern, and so we don't report it out that way. But if you're interested, happy to point people to that.
Great, thank you. From the charts you shown, the graphs, it seemed like there was quite high support for renewable energy policy in 2008, and then it dropped off, and it's been gradually increasing over the past several years. Do you have a hypothesis for why things fell from 2008 into the early teens?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I'll be honest that I joined the survey in 2013. So this is something that I often ask about as well. We see this same shape for almost every other question that we have. So attitudes about climate change and whether it's occurring and what's causing it follows this very same curve. So in almost all of the situations, the fall 2008 data has highest belief in anthropogenic climate change and highest support for a range of energy policies. My colleagues, we've debated this internally about why we're seeing this. We think that in some situations, the fall 2008 survey was coming in was fielded leading up to the 2008 election, and the idea was that we were going to do something big on a national scale about climate change, and then it quickly got politicized, and this is where other research too has found that we start to see kind of a divergence based on particularly political factors. That's starting to close again, and that's what we've seen, both on belief in climate change itself and in support for policies. But that's what we think is going on, but that's not something that we've delved into too deeply.
Okay, thank you. A couple people asked about ballot initiatives, and one person writes, I've read that if a voter doesn't understand an issue, then they're likely to vote no. How does the average survey respondent's lack of technical knowledge about renewable policy influence their responses to those ballot initiatives? Is that potentially one reason why some ballot initiatives have had a hard time, that people don't understand these policies all that well?
I think that that's certainly the case, and our survey would suggest that people don't really follow what's going on. I think a critique often of survey research is, and you might look at our survey and say, you're finding Americans have, 70% of Americans support renewable portfolio standards. So why do we see some ballot initiatives fail? And a critique of survey research is, well, it's a hypothetical. You're not actually asking them to shell out additional money for, on their electricity bill to meet the RPS. Or it's simplifying it, and there may be other aspects of the ballot initiative that they don't necessarily support. So I think that it's both that there's less understanding, or Americans are just not following this very closely, is among the reasons that I think we see less support for ballot initiatives than what surveys like this might suggest, and also just the salience of whether this is actually going to happen.
Good. I want to throw in a comment myself in response to one of your comments, where you talked about that there's a significant proportion of people, it's not a majority, but a significant proportion now, who are willing to pay a good amount extra for renewable energy. And the argument is that should be good for green pricing programs. I remember here in Massachusetts, we had some survey data, and it didn't translate very well into support for green pricing programs, in part because there's a follow-up question that a lot of people are willing to pay more if everybody else has to pay more as well. But if it's only them paying voluntarily, they're not so enthusiastic about it. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah, I believe that. So willingness to pay is one of the things that's really tricky on survey research, and it's, whether you're talking about energy policy or anything else where you're asking about willingness to pay, until you actually ask people for their credit card number, it ought to be taken with a grain of salt. That there are more people who say they are willing to pay now than in the past, I think shows a trend that means that underlying there may well be more people that are willing to pay. The equity issue about whether that you raise is a very good one, and something we're considering looking at green pricing programs for a future survey wave. We haven't asked a question previously about the voluntary green pricing programs, and that's something that I think we certainly could ask about.
Okay. A couple people asked about whether you have data broken down by state and whether there's enough data to make the state level results meaningful.
Yeah, so we collect state. That's something that is available in the downloadable data sets, is the state that people are coming from. On any individual survey, we don't, because it's a nationally representative sample, we don't have enough responses from any particular state. Even California, we're often we often get between 80 and 100 depending on our sample size. So respondents, which is just not enough to really be statistically significant. You just have huge margins of error there. For some questions on willingness to pay, for example, where we've asked it so many times, it's possible to aggregate across waves. You can do the same thing on the questions that we always ask about attitudes towards climate change. But when you're only asking a question 2 or 3 times, there's just not enough data to aggregate at the state level. You can break it down regionally, and that's a variable that we include in our data sets. we break it into 4 regions of the country. We rarely see any differences across regions, so we never report out on regions. Um, you could also break it down, as I did on an earlier slide, based on, what kind of policies are in place in states. So whether or not the state has a renewable portfolio standard or not is, there would be enough statistical significance or a small enough margin of error here that you could see whether there were statistical differences. But generally speaking, even with, having 1,000 responses is pretty good. But it's difficult to say anything at the state level.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Do you collaborate with or exchange information with other groups that conduct surveys, such as the Yale program on climate change communication and the program at George Mason University?
Yes, so we're definitely in communication with them. I know that there's been a couple of researchers who have tried to pull data from across these 3 surveys to kind of compare results. And Chris Borick, our colleague at Muhlenberg College, has closer collaborations just because he's kind of the pollster among the 3 of us.
Okay. And have you at all looked at results of public opinion surveys in Canada? And if so, do you have a sense where the Canadian results differ significantly from the U.S. findings?
That's a great question. And in many of these NSEE at 10 reports, we actually have what we call Canada Corners. There is a sister survey that is carried out by Eric Lachapelle at the University of Montreal. He hasn't been doing it quite as long, but has a very sizable Canada sample. And so we're able to compare on many issues. We didn't get the data to be able to compare on renewable portfolio standards. So we're waiting that. We're hoping that we'll be able to revise these reports and include some U.S.-Canada comparisons on this. On many of the other issues, though, that we've looked at where we have done the U.S.-Canada comparisons, we do tend to see that Canadians are more supportive of climate policy and more accepting of the idea of anthropogenic climate change. What comes to mind is, carbon taxes. We've done a lot of comparison there because of the policies in place in Canada. And there is generally a 10 to 20 point, it kind of depends on what the question is, higher level of support for those climate policies in Canada than we see in the U.S.
Okay. And, you point out that, and not just point out, you have findings that show a high percentage of people don't know whether their state has an RPS, and we could use that potentially as a proxy for those folks who follow renewable energy policy closely. Is there any way to use that data to see if the views of the folks who know whether their state has an RPS end up being different than the views of those folks who don't?
I would say yes and no. I think the idea of that is fantastic, and I think that that there's lots of great hypotheses that you could draw. Like, you might imagine that the people that are in this circle here who live in a state with an RPS and know that their state has the RPS, they may be different on, their attitudes may be different on a range of policies. The challenge is that here we have 12% of a sample size of 500. And so when we've tried to look at this, the margins of error are just too large to really be able to say anything significant. And so we would need to ask this question much more frequently. and actually, as I was pulling these slides together, it made me think, given all of the attention now to climate, I think it may be time for us to ask this and questions about what additional states will do towards their renewable portfolio standards. This might be a good time to add this knowledge question to the survey. Again, this is one where you could potentially aggregate what you know about the people that are kind of in this circle over time. But then you also have to account for the fact that, there are a range of attitudes that are changing over time.
Yes. And you made clear why it's not possible for you to have good state level results. But have you considered, or would you consider, doing some analysis in the future based on broader geographic categories, such as, dividing the country into 3 or 4 regions, in which case you might get significant size samples, or dividing between states with high penetration of renewable energy versus states with low penetration of renewable energy?
Yes, that's something that we could definitely do. And again, on the regions, the 4 regions we have done, and find no differences to speak of. Sometimes there's differences in terms of attitudes about whether the link between climate and extreme weather events, particularly, for example, what stands out to me is folks in the West pointing a lot towards drought and wildfires as evidence that climate change exists, more so than folks in other parts of the country. So that's where we see regional differences. But in terms of energy policy, that's not something that we find very often. And so you can do it. I'm not sure how much difference you would find. We've also, in the past, on other policies, for example, we've taken the RGGI states in New England and looked at how their attitudes about a cap and trade program compare to those in states where there is no, so the rest of the country, separated California out of that, where there is no cap and trade program, to try to understand that. Honestly, their attitudes on cap and trade, for that example, there aren't any notable differences in attitudes about cap and trade in the RGGI states versus non-RGGI states. Certainly you can do it, but I think at least what we've found from our preliminary internal analyses is that it doesn't, perhaps because few people are aware of whether or not their state has these energy policies in place, we don't pick up on the differences.
Okay, that makes logical sense. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question from the audience, and then I will give you an opportunity to say anything else you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say up till now. And so the last audience question I want to mention is, have you considered asking a question or questions about 100% renewable energy standards, given that is a policy gaining some momentum on the political left and is getting more discussion?
We have not asked that question, but that's certainly something that we could ask. And I have a running list of the things that I'd love to ask on the next survey, and I think that suggestion certainly helps move that one up the list. So thanks for that suggestion.
And do you have any famous last words for folks here? Anything you want to say but haven't had a chance to say up till now, or any points you want to reemphasize other than everybody should go to your website to learn more about what's being done at the University of Michigan?
On the survey, no, but since there's people interested in renewable portfolio standards, I can't help myself. A lot of my work has been in communities where rural communities where wind energy is being proposed, and something that strikes me these folks, are 20% of the U.S. population, so we just don't survey that many of them on our national survey. But anecdotally, what I hear a lot is skepticism that the presence of a renewable portfolio standard in the minds of a lot of these rural residents suggests that it's proof that renewable energy, wind energy, doesn't pay for itself, that it needs a state mandate, or that it needs a federal tax subsidy in order to pay for itself, that it's a boondoggle. So that's something that even if it's a small percentage of Americans who say that they don't like renewable portfolio standards, I think we need to think about where those people live. And if they live in the communities where we want to be citing renewable energy, we need to give that some credence. So I'm trying to work on how to measure that effectively, because again, rural communities are hard to survey, but it's something that anecdotally comes up an awful lot in my work.
Hey, thanks very much for mentioning that point, but more for your really excellent presentation today and your responses to a wide range of questions. We will, through our newsletter, let people know when you have additional survey results in the future, and maybe there'll be another time when it makes sense to come back to talk to our audience again. So thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks for everybody who tuned in today.
Thank you.